Counsel and Policy Director of the Judicial Crisis Network and former law clerk for Justice Clarence Thomas. Carrie Severino goes on the record. Nice to see you, Carrie.
Good to see you, Greta.
What do you think if your former boss had said this about Hillary Clinton?
Oh, my goodness. It would be an explosion. You'd have people in their stump speeches calling for his resignation. You'd have people trying to impeach him. I mean, it would have been just out of control. And I think that really shows, as you were saying, there's a clear double standard here about what people are expecting. And while we have, thankfully, I think, the Washington Post and the New York Times admitting this is so far out of bounds of what justices have said, they certainly have not said the kind of things they would have done, I think, if Justice Thomas had been there.
See, I think it's frightening. I mean, I know that we all walk into every case as a lawyer with some bias, and we try to set the biases aside, but it's never quite so passionate as this. And I think, you know, you clerked in the Supreme Court. I mean, it's sort of frightening to me to think that the Supreme Court has a justice who is, I mean, I guess I should be happy for the transparency. She laid it all out for us, but I think it's frightening.
Yeah, I think, again, we're not totally surprised because, unfortunately, her tenure as a justice has been marked by using the law to achieve her political goals and ends, and she's been more and more transparent about that in her comments lately. But I think it's also discouraging because it really shows the court in a bad light. I think it's discouraging also to see that someone like Secretary Clinton, who has not stepped up and said something criticism of this, because Justice Ginsburg's basically decided to work as her surrogate. If she wants to be a surrogate for Hillary Clinton, she should just step down and do that honestly.
Well, I think she's hurt Secretary Clinton by this. Because I think she's given a great fundraising issue to the Republicans, as well as, you know, it feeds right into their theory that we know how important the Supreme Court is for this next presidency. We've also got the situation where you got the Attorney General having a meeting with Secretary Clinton's husband on the plane. A lot of people are suspicious about this. I mean, it's almost as though these people are making it very difficult for Secretary Clinton.
Yeah, and it just shows another area where can people really trust her to now appoint someone who's not going to be politicized? Remember, Ginsburg was a Bill Clinton appointee to the court, and do we want another judge appointed by another Clinton who's going to be the same kind of thing, someone who is basically a politician in robes trying to just use the court to achieve their political ends? Unfortunately, Ginsburg has done that, and as we all know, it's not just the Scalia vacancy that hangs in the balance with the next president. It's going to be possibly Ginsburg's vacancy and others as well.
Well, assuming they fill the vacancy of Scalia, and we have 9 justices, and assuming that Donald Trump becomes president, how in the world can she ever fail to recuse herself on any case involving something, especially like executive powers?
Oh, I think it'd be very difficult. And certainly if we saw a Bush v. Gore type case, she would have to recuse herself, right, during the election season. But she's been so clear and doubled down and tripled down on this issue. I think she'd face a lot of pressure to recuse on almost any presidential issue. So that's going to be a real issue going forward if she stays in the court.
Got to give her credit for transparency. I mean, she's not hiding her hate for him.
Yeah, no, although I got to say, it's kind of like the old saying, it's better to keep your mouth shut and be thought maybe a politicized judge in this case than to open your mouth and prove it. And she opened her mouth pretty big this time.
Well, it's quite shocking. Anyway, Carrie, thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
And make sure you read Carrie's opinion piece on Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. We just posted a link on GretaWire.com, and you don't want to miss reading it. And the on-the-record legal panel is here. Former homicide detective and criminal defense attorney Ted Williams and former prosecutor Katie Fang. Okay, Ted. You and I talked a little bit before this. You may be the only one who I could find who's supporting Ginsburg on this, or at least not, you know, calling for her head.
Well,
did you hear Katie groan?
I heard it, but I'm not calling. I'm not calling for her head. She's a Supreme Court justice, and Supreme Court justices, Greta, are like God. Nobody can get them but God.
So God's taking sides up there?
Well, I don't know if God is taking sides, but I will say this. Ruth Bader Ginsburg has lived long enough to see what she believes as an American is wrong about Donald Trump.
Stop right there. Then she should step down and do that. You know, stop right there.
Tell me one code that says that she has to step down.
Well, I think we'd like to think that the Supreme Court is not as politicized as that.
Well, then when Justice Thomas had his wife with a committee, and he sat there while she was dealing with Obamacare, when you had Cheney going hunting with Scalia, when you had Kagan, who was already in the White House with Obama and came over to the Supreme Court. All of them had conflicts. We can't just hold Ruth Bader Ginsburg to a different standard.
Well, you know, Katie, I think Ted raises a good point, although I must say that Justice Ginsburg's bias is a little more passionate, although I've given her credit for transparency.
Yeah, listen, you can give her credit for transparency, but ultimately, guys, we know this. Procedurally, there's one vehicle by which she does not listen to these cases, and that's through recusal. And who decides to recuse? The justice, him or herself. So even if they try to get her off these cases, ultimately it's her decision whether or not she's going to be off these cases. And I think she played her hand improperly. If you really don't like Donald Trump as much as Ruth Bader Ginsburg claims she doesn't like him, why not be a little bit more, I don't know, insidious? Or a little bit more subtle. Why not keep your mouth shut and then roll the way that you want to roll? But she's taking judicial activism way too far.
I think, the problem is that, the very things she criticizes Trump for are sort of the things she's doing. I mean, that's the sort of the she doesn't recognize the hypocrisy. And I sort of wanted to respect the institution. I mean, I know we all come into the stuff with bias, and even Justice Kagan, who used to work at the Justice Department, I've known her around town, and I think she could set aside her, her past experience. This actually, though, goes way too far for me. This is like way too ugly, and she's acting just like she accuses Trump of doing, of just blowing her mouth off.
Well, that may be true, but Katie just said something. And when it comes to recusal, the only person who can recuse Justice Ginsburg is Justice Ginsburg,
yeah, but if
and
she
it's not going to happen.
But if she doesn't, Ted, that says so much more. After expressing such vitriol, such hate for Trump, if she then, I mean, yes, it's her choice. She gets to decide whether to disqualify herself, but if she doesn't that say so much more about the system?
Well, wait a minute. Trump has already come out and said what judges he wants on the Supreme Court, and he's already made a litmus test for those judges, and now we want to jump on Ginsburg? Give me a break.
Katie?
Listen, there is a federal code, 28 U.S.C. 455, that actually says if there's a reasonable fear or a reasonable concern that there's going to be a lack of impartiality, then you got to get yourself off of a case, and that applies to United States Supreme Court justices. But really, Trump, if he makes the presidency, you don't think he's going to make a retaliatory appointment? Ruth Bader Ginsburg is 83 years old. It's a life appointment. I get it, but you got two other justices. Breyer is 80. These seats are going to come up, and you don't think that Trump's going to stack that court? So, again, I would have been a little bit more subtle and played my card a little bit more subtly if I were her.
I just hope so that, at the end of the day, the people, at least when you got to the Supreme Court, would try to be decent. Whether it's who you put on the bench, that use your best mind in putting someone you think is fair and the right person. And, I just actually find this rather shocking, even though I think Ted's angling for a clerkship, with Justice Ginsburg. Because he is the only one. Ted, even the New York Times and the Washington Post.
I don't care. We're all human. She's an American. She has her opinion, and she can exercise that opinion from the bench.
Nobody said she doesn't have a nobody said she doesn't have a First Amendment right to say it. What we're saying, we're questioning her judgment. Anyway, Ted, Katie, thank you both. I'm not talking to Ted anymore either.